Hello, listeners to Retelling the Bible. I have a very special treat for you today. I have a story to tell you as usual, but it's a very special story that has been inspired by the work of a new friend. Gil Kidron, a writer, editor, and podcaster from Tel Aviv, has been working through the Hebrew Bible on his podcast, which is called A Podcast of Biblical Proportions. He is now going through the book of Exodus, and he has some interesting theories about who wrote some portions of that book. That led to some other speculation on the second part of the book of Isaiah and the prophet Jeremiah. All of that inspired the story in this episode of the podcast. Even better, stick around after the episode for a discussion between me and Gil about the story, his theories, and biblical storytelling in general. To Shemaiah of Nehelam you shall say, Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, in your own name you sent letters to all the people who are in Jerusalem, and to the priest Zephaniah, and to all the priests, saying, The Lord himself has made you priest instead of the priest Jehoiada, so that there may be officers in the house of the Lord to control any madman who plays the prophet, to put him in the stocks and the collar. So now, why have you not rebuked Jeremiah of Anathoth, who plays the prophet for you? For he has actually sent to us in Babylon, saying, It will be a long time. Build houses and live in them, and plant gardens and eat what they produce. That is a portion of an account of some very extraordinary correspondence that is described in the 29th chapter of the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah has been writing to exiles in Babylon from Jerusalem in the last few years before the final fall of Jerusalem to the kingdom of Babylon. He has also been responding to some letters sent back to Jerusalem by an exile named Shemaiah of Nehelam. But the unfortunate thing in the book of Jeremiah is that we only get one side of this letter-writing conversation. We are told what Jeremiah wrote and why, and Jeremiah has some extremely negative views of the people he is corresponding with, but we don't really get the other side of the conversation, except for how it is framed by Jeremiah. And, given Jeremiah's feelings on the matter, I'm not sure we can trust him to be unbiased. But it seemed that was just how things were. Shemaiah's letters were lost, and there was no way to recover them. He could no longer speak for himself, and so he had to take Jeremiah's word for what he was preaching off in Babylon. That is, up until now. My new friend and fellow podcaster, Gil Kidron of A Podcast of Biblical Proportions, has a theory. He thinks that Shemaiah's letters, or at least part of them, were not lost. They were saved, and eventually ended up being incorporated into what we know today as the book of Isaiah, specifically in chapters 40 to the middle of chapter 44. He is certainly correct that part of Isaiah was written during the exile. Scholars have long recognized that. It is also certainly plausible that those chapters could fit with the historical context of the first wave of the exile, with the time of Shemaiah. I will leave it to Gil to defend his theory and offer his other evidence, but for my part, I just love a good bit of speculation. So I'm just going to go with it for this episode. What if we actually do have both sides of this conversation spread through the books of Jeremiah and this section of Isaiah? How might such an understanding make us read the story of the clash between Jeremiah and Shemaiah differently? This is Retelling the Bible. Wait a minute. There are perhaps a few things about this particular story that we, as modern people, might be unfamiliar with. First of all, what is this whole thing about people communicating through correspondence? Well, you see, once upon a time, people used to do this thing called writing letters. It was sort of like when you text someone or when you post a message on Twitter, but you used to have to do it by writing it out by hand. And then you had to give it to people to deliver. I know, it sounds complicated, but that was how it worked. Except it was even more complicated for people in our story. Jeremiah and Shemaiah couldn't write. Very few people back then could. So they had to hire other people to write for them and to read out any responses. We know that Jeremiah often used a man named Baruch as his scribe. We don't know who did that job for Shemaiah, but my friend Gil likes to refer to Shemaiah's scribe as the Nehelamite. And he's got a few theories about the Nehelamite. So, all of that is rather different from how communications work today. So, I will do my best to translate the story of the clash of these two prophetic titans into something that we can relate to. This, once again, is Retelling the Bible. Special episode, Jeremiah's Twitter beef. Jeremiah had a way of dropping in at his friend Baruch's house at all hours. He would just show up in the middle of the afternoon, like today, and expect that Baruch would drop everything that he was doing and just attend to Jeremiah's latest thoughts or conspiracy theories. "Hey, Baruch," Jeremiah called out as he let himself into the man's living room. "I was wondering if you could find out for me what was happening among the exiles in Babylon." Baruch rolled his eyes as he got up from his couch and walked over to the kitchen counter to pick up his phone. He had tried many times to explain to Jeremiah how various social media apps worked. Jeremiah had an insatiable curiosity about what was going on in the world. He believed that Yahweh spoke directly to him whenever he meditated on various current events. So, if he had only learned for himself how to use Twitter, he could have satisfied his need to be in the know all by himself. But Jeremiah was a confirmed technophobe. He always insisted that it was too complicated and that Baruch would have to do it for him. By this point, Baruch had gotten tired of arguing, and so he grabbed his phone and opened up Twitter. He did a search. The latest hashtag that had been trending for the exiles in Babylon was #ExileLife. And so he searched for that. It didn't take him long to find something that he knew would get Jeremiah's gears turning. "How about this one?" he asked. It is by a guy named Shemaiah, who claims in his bio to be a prophet of Yahweh. This is what he has posted. "Comfort, oh, comfort my people, says your God." Baruch began to read as Jeremiah started to sip on a cup of wine. "Speak tenderly to Jerusalem, and cry to her that she has served her term, that her penalty is paid, that she has received from Yahweh's hand double for all her sins." Jeremiah was so shocked at what he had heard that he sprayed the entire contents of the cup of wine all over Baruch's wall. "What?" he cried. "Is that false prophet saying what I think he's saying? He thinks that God is finished punishing Jerusalem for all of its sins? That the penalty has been paid in full? Ha! This Shemaiah fellow has no idea. They've only been exiles in Babylon for what, 3 years or so? Jerusalem is still standing, and so God has only just begun to make Jerusalem pay. Quick, Baruch. I feel the word of Yahweh coming to me. You must write one of those tweets that you're constantly trying to educate me about. Post this. Thus says Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon, build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat what they produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters... Hold on a sec, Baruch interrupted. That's 280 characters. I'm going to have to make this a thread. Give me a second here and... Okay. Keep going. Jeremiah impatiently waited, and then, once Baruch had given him the sign, continued. Give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there, and do not decrease, but seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to Yahweh on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. There, Baruch, send that. That will put Shemaiah in his place. And so the Twitter battle between Jeremiah and Shemaiah began. And you can bet that as soon as Shemaiah heard from his talented scribe, the Nehelamite, the message Jeremiah had sent out, he was livid. Who does Jeremiah think he is? He raged. Why does he think that he, in Jerusalem, knows better than me what Yahweh is saying to the people in Babylon? So he thinks that we should build houses and live in them. Ha! That's not what God is saying. God doesn't want us to build houses. God wants us to build a highway. Yes, a highway right through the desert that lies between Babylon and Jerusalem, so that we may go home. Here, tweet this thread, my dear Nehelamite. A voice cries out, "In the wilderness, prepare the way of Yahweh. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. Then the glory of Yahweh shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. For the mouth of Yahweh has spoken." So went the battle, as tweets flew across the vast distance between Jerusalem and Babylon. Jeremiah blasted out this rant. "Thus says Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel, do not let the prophets and the diviners who are among you deceive you, and do not listen to your dreams that you dream. For it is a lie that they are prophesying to you in my name. I did not send them, says Yahweh." And of course, Shemaiah was so outraged by the very suggestion that the word of Yahweh that he had spoken might be questioned, that his response was unequivocal. "A voice says, 'Cry out,' and I said, 'What shall I cry?' All flesh is grass, and their constancy is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever." As in any Twitter beef, emotions were soon elevated to the extreme. In the end, each of the men attempted to cancel the other. Shemaiah had the Nehelamite send a DM to Zephaniah the priest in Jerusalem saying, "Yahweh himself has made you priest instead of the priest Jehoiada, so that there may be officers in the house of Yahweh to control any madman who plays the prophet, to put him in the stocks and the collar. So why have you not rebuked Jeremiah of Anathoth, who plays the prophet for you?" But Jeremiah felt that he had a higher authority to appeal to, and so he ordered Baruch to send this to the exiles. "Thus says Yahweh concerning Shemaiah of Nehelam, because Shemaiah has prophesied to you, though I did not send him, and has led you to trust in a lie, therefore thus says Yahweh, I am going to punish Shemaiah of Nehelam and his descendants. He shall not have anyone living among this people to see the good that I am going to do to my people, says Yahweh, for he has spoken rebellion against Yahweh." The first 39 chapters of the book of Isaiah are closely connected to the activities and preaching of the prophet Isaiah in the 8th century BCE. But after that, the book changes. The prophet Isaiah is no longer mentioned, and the prophecies are given anonymously. But they also speak to a very different historical context. The words are clearly addressed to people who are living in exile in Babylon, and they really would have meant nothing to the people who had lived in the time of Isaiah some 2 centuries earlier. That is why scholars now believe that the second part of Isaiah was written in Babylon during the exile. A lot of it was clearly written near the end of the exile, around the time when Cyrus the Persian conquered Babylon, which set the stage for the exiles to return home. But Gil has suggested that the first few chapters, 40 through the middle of 44, make more sense if we understand them as being set at the beginning, specifically in the period when a first wave of exiles had been taken away to Babylon, but before Jerusalem had finally fallen for good. I find this to be a very interesting and compelling idea, especially because we know about an extraordinary exchange that occurred at that time between the prophet Jeremiah in Jerusalem and the prophet Shemaiah in Babylon. Of course, neither of these fellows thought the other guy was a true prophet, but that was how they saw themselves. So, what if, Gil asks, Shemaiah is the prophet who was actually behind the prophecies we find in Isaiah 40 to 44? Interesting idea. I mean, what was the content of the letter that he sent to Jerusalem and that Jeremiah so strongly objected to? Suddenly, it seemed to me that maybe, just maybe, we might have a handle on how the prophecies of Jeremiah and those of 2nd Isaiah did not simply stand alone, but were actually part of an ongoing conversation. I am thankful to Gil for an opportunity to reimagine the messages of both prophets. And now, here is the discussion between Gil and me.
Hi, Scott.
Hi, Gil. Wonderful to finally meet you, or sort of see you face to face, 7 hours apart, but yes.
Because we have been corresponding in the way that, us modern folk correspond. No longer writing by hand, this ancient way.
Sending it with a messenger to run all the way from Jerusalem to Babylon and back, yes.
I love this part of the story because it kind of made me relate more to their reality than to this reality where you could just tweet everything. It's kind of crazy that this is possible.
Yes.
So that was a good part of the story.
Yes, but it still made it clear that there was a bit of a conversation going on, even though it would have taken enormous amounts of time for that information to pass that distance. There seems to be a conversation going on, which is really interesting. Yeah.
It's really interesting. And so first of all, I would like to ask you about this contrast between Jeremiah and Shemaiah. Like, basically what Jeremiah is saying is that Nebuchadnezzar will come in and just like annihilate everything and everybody.
Yes.
This is it's very extreme.
Absolutely. Yes.
And he goes to extreme lengths also to kill his opponents.
Yes.
To burn them at the stake. This is Shemaiah basically preaches the opposite. He says, no, Yahweh will bring happiness and victory and a return. The same God, same religion, quote unquote, completely contrasting ways of seeing the world.
Maybe Jeremiah, I think, might be the first to come up with such a clear delineation of what a false prophet is. So Jeremiah is the one who says, if you say it and it comes true, you are a true prophet. If you say it and it's not true, you are a false prophet. And I think that I see Jeremiah definitely, he is opposing himself to his conversation partner, because the disasters that Jeremiah has been talking about have largely happened. So he does feel vindicated. And when he runs into other prophets who are saying peace and prosperity and everything's going to be rosy, he just feels these people are just they're just wishful thinking.
Right.
Yeah.
He mentions in his book, he mentions the prophets that prophesied that everything will be fine.
Yeah.
We don't have those prophecies because when everything was not fine, I guess people didn't feel that they had a lot of value.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't have them. But we have the prophecies of Jeremiah because he was right on the big thing.
Yes. But it's kind of interesting because if you're right and Shemaiah is represented in those first, 40 chapter 40 of Isaiah from on, I mean, Shemaiah then was kind of wrong. He said, though the punishment's over, we're going back, this is done. Well, of course, the exile dragged on and on. Now, eventually he got vindicated, when eventually Cyrus came along and it was time to go back. But for a long time, his prophecies seemed to be completely false.
And he wasn't there, right,
Yeah.
to see it. So just like it must have been very, very hard when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And everything that he believed in and hoped for and prophesied just came crashing down. And we don't have his text from that period. I don't know if he continued to prophesize even wow, that seems like something a very, very tough experience.
It's easy to imagine he would have been completely demoralized and maybe wondered, maybe Yahweh never did speak to me kind of thing. Yeah. But yeah.
Wow. So I wanted to ask you, so you are a minister.
I am, yes, Presbyterian.
And in your podcast, you focus on storytelling, pretty obviously. So how do you handle the two, and how do you approach the retelling of the Bible? We have different perspectives, but we kind of do the same thing, retelling the Bible. How do you approach that?
You see, my job, my regular week-by-week job is to interpret the Bible for the church and apply it to the church, which I love. It's a wonderful privilege. But I started doing the podcast to do something different because I just wanted to take the Bible and, these wonderful, rich stories and present them to the world, not necessarily to the church. So I tried to step away from, direct applications to the church and say, this is a wonderful story and let's tell the story kind of thing. And so what I like to do, and I try to do, is I especially like to take a different approach to the story, tell it from a different angle, maybe tell it from the point of view of a minor character or a character that has often been, forgotten or misrepresented. So I try to tell the other side of the story. But it's also sort of, I've heard these stories so often, and it's just a matter of trying to live it out, practically. What did this story look like for this to happen in the way that I'm telling it? You have to say, well, how did this person get over there? How did this resource that they used in the story happen to be there? All of those little details.
You have to edit the story.
I do, and it sends you down all kinds of rabbit holes and makes you ask all kind of questions. Like, if I can give an example, a story I'm working on right now, the famous story where Abraham is sitting outside of his tent and three visitors come along, three strangers come along. Well, one of the first things he does after he invites them in for a little morsel of bread, he runs to the tent and he yells out to his wife, take 3 measures of flour and make cakes. Well, I went and researched that, and like the measure that he says is like 3 seahs of flour, which is a whole lot of flour. I went and I did the conversions and I calculated, and it's 25 kilograms of flour. He says for her to take. I said, hold on, there's something going on here.
You can't even carry that.
Yes, and how long does it take to bake 25?
Oh my goodness.
So those kinds of practical questions, I I just love to.
Maybe the man who wrote it, he said, okay, whatever.
Well,
25
maybe.
kilograms.
But then he also goes and he kills an entire calf, roasts it up. So, I mean, it's an unbelievable meal that he prepares, right? And meanwhile, you got 3 people sitting outside the tent waiting while Sarah bakes that many cakes and we kill and roast an entire calf. I mean, who waits that long for a meal? So those kinds of practical questions, and obviously there's something going on there quite intentionally, but those are the questions that I love to ask. So it's, I like to know what, say, for example, the scholars have said about when it was written and maybe what the context was, but it's, which is what I really appreciate, your approach. You really dig into what the historical context of the story is. Sometimes I'll let that kind of thing inform me, but sometimes it's enough just to really just imagine the story and the way it was, and it gives you a whole different perspective. And even the fantastic elements, the unbelievable, miraculous elements. Sometimes when you tell the story, you can sort of imagine how something might have happened that people interpreted as a miracle, and I like to take that perspective sometimes too. So.
Actually, I think that I can really identify with your approach, and I go into the scholarship angle only after I got a sense of the story, reading it over and over and over and over in isolate, and just like forgetting everything that I know about it and everything that I've been told that it is, because it's very limiting if you first go to what everybody says about the story. No, you just like read it, just let it marinate for a while, and then it could just like come to you like, hey, how come they killed all these babies, but nobody else mentions the dead babies?
Yeah,
that's weird. And then I go to see what scholars say, and then they say the guy that wrote this, they call him the e-source. He's like an isolate, and the things that he writes about are not mentioned in the J, P, and D.
They're separate stories that never got integrated. Yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
But that's just like a weird academic kind of thinking that just like obscures the fact that, hey, this appears at the beginning. If the dead babies are not mentioned later, then we have to look at how this story was constructed. This must not have been something that the other people agreed upon, because then they would talk about their babies because they remember the plagues they remember and the hardship they remember.
Exactly.
So only later come back into scholarship in order to see, that I'm not way off somewhere, beyond the lines and bounds of reason. Mm-hmm. But first thing is, it's just the story. What is the story? Like, a story is not nonsense. People write a story, there's intent behind every story. What is the intent? What are they trying to say? What is their perspective? I'm not sure that scholars are, better suited for that than you and I to understand a story. Yeah. If you look at it just as a story, then we all have skills to understand stories.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, I mean, and somebody once said that, one of the things that distinguished human beings from any other animal is that we are storytelling animals. We make sense of the world by telling stories. And this is this is what they were doing, and this is what we continue to do. And of course, by retelling these stories, we do make them relevant, I often find, to what's actually going on in the world today.
Yes, exactly. This is my point. I think that most of the stories in Exodus, for example, the writers are retelling existing stories to make them relevant for what's going on in the world for them, the Babylonian exile. They didn't invent out of whole cloth the story of Hebrews leaving Egypt into freedom through the desert and getting their laws from a mountain and crossing a sea while the Pharaoh's chariots are drowning. They didn't invent that. They retold that story in order to make it relevant for their audience sitting in the Babylonian exile. So this is why so much of the stories that we have in Exodus always are so relevant for the people in the Babylonian exile. Mm-hmm. And when you think about it, maybe if you're lucky, you can be like another link in the chain of retelling these stories. Do you want to talk about the midwife story, the baby Moses story, or do you want to go to the beef between Jeremiah and Shemaiah?
Well, maybe let's go to the beef for now, and if we want to come
Yeah.
back to the other stories, we can. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, let's go to the beef.
Yeah.
How do you see this beef? Beyond the story that we just heard in your episode.
Well, you sort of just gave me the opportunity to sort of see this story from a bit of a different point of view. See, when I went through seminary, when I was taught the book of Isaiah, I was taught, okay, the first 39 chapters, that's, all around the original prophet Isaiah. The second bit up until, 55, is second Isaiah. And I was always taught, okay, that's all late exile, when Cyrus is coming and it's time to go home. So just, the episode you had done gave me permission to say, okay, let's look at those first few chapters. And before Cyrus comes into the story, before he gets mentioned. And when you look at it closely, it makes sense that it sort of seems to be set in that early exile period, the first wave of exile, because it seems like Jerusalem still exists. That was the thing that really struck me when I looked at it again. Yeah, Jerusalem still seems to be there. The idea of a return is not, okay, we're returning to a deserted country. We are returning to something that already exists. So I said, okay, maybe Gil's got a point. So maybe that is, and then
I guess so. Another point of evidence, sorry, just for that, he's clearly talking to over and over and over and over the kinds of people that we know were in the first wave of exile. The Harash והמסגר, the artisan, the craftsman, the goldsmith, the blacksmith, whatever you want to call them.
that class, yeah.
He just constantly, just like you have like 10, 15 mentions of those specific kinds of people that were with him.
Yes. And the other thing is he speaks of Jerusalem. It seems like it still exists. Send to Jerusalem, speak to Jerusalem. So, so there's that. So I said, okay, so that's early exile. And then, in your episode, you went through, well, who do we know that was in exile that could have been saying this kind of thing? And you ended up from Jeremiah's letter with Shemaiah. He's the only one who sort of seems to have been pretty active over there. We know he was there. We know that he was sending letters, because Jeremiah tells us, back to Jerusalem.
And we know that he preached a return.
Yes.
So like this Shemaiah and second Isaiah are aligned in that.
So it's a very similar. So why not go with it? Okay, so this is Shemaiah. So and then once I did that, I said, okay, you lie up. Okay, he says, the opening message in Isaiah 40 is comfort. The punishment's over. Time to go back. Okay, that makes sense. Whereas Jeremiah, we have him saying, well, no, don't go. You're not coming back. You're going to build houses. You're going to live in them.
That's very harsh.
Yes.
I think that one thing that your episode did very well, and that I don't think I emphasized, how intense this must have been. He's telling them, you're going to stay in exile your whole life, your sons, your grandsons. Wow, they must have been
It's got to be devastating.
appalled.
Yeah.
Devastated,
Yeah. And then, if Jeremiah is sending a message, build houses, well, what's the next thing that we see in Isaiah? We see, no, we're not building houses, we're building a highway. A voice, and I see this Shemaiah speaking to himself, right? I am the voice crying out, and the voice is crying out, no, we're not building houses, we're building a highway, we're going home. And this incredible passage that has lived on ever since, of every valley shall be lifted up, every mountain and hill be made low. This is imagery of a construction of a highway. So you can sort of see, once you open up the possibility, you can see it as a bit of a conversation. And obviously, given the distance, letters would have taken months and months to pass. So it's not like an immediate conversation, but sort of reimagining it as what we would have today, an immediate conversation over Twitter, well, that kind of made it more active and more clear. So it made it more fun.
Yeah. You don't have to wait 3 months to get annoyed at the other person.
Right. Yes. If, as we say, those first few chapters after Isaiah 40 are written, first wave of exile, with this incredible promise, okay, this is all over, we're going home. And then, of course, it doesn't happen. And the exile gets worse and more people go away and Jerusalem's destroyed. You can well imagine that text would have been put aside and said, well, this guy didn't know what he was talking about, right?
Yeah.
But then when finally, years later, decades later, Cyrus comes along,
right,
and all of a sudden a return seems possible, I can well imagine somebody finding that original text,
boom,
and saying, oh, all of a sudden this is now relevant. So we start a new book with those few chapters, and then we start talking about Cyrus and how God is using Cyrus. And I also can see, looking forward, some of the themes that Shemaiah would have introduced in his chapters, like the suffering servant is a big one, and this new thing that God is doing, those ideas then get remixed into the rest of that middle part of Isaiah as well. And there's, it goes on and on about a suffering servant that gets rethought and reimagined as well. So all of that. So I can see somebody taking that, reusing it for the new situation that now we are going home. So now all of a sudden, what Shemaiah said that didn't seem relevant for a long time, now is relevant. And we can remix it and work with it and tell a new story.
And that happens all the time. Thinkers say something that is relevant, then situation changes, it's not relevant. Then the situation changes again, they reemerge a few hundred years later, and now people remember, hey, this guy got it right. It happens all the time. It's not some weird coincidence.
Mm-hmm.
I always am of two minds. Should I list all the evidence and then there's the danger of information overload?
Yeah.
Or if I skip over some of them, but then there's a risk that people don't fully appreciate all the connections, and then maybe it's not as impactful. So in the previous episode, I mentioned all the Easter eggs, but I only specifically mentioned one, the Pu'ah. As a woman in childbirth, I cry out. That is just such a weird combination that the moment that I saw it, I was like, oh my goodness, this looks like a reference to that.
To the name of the midwife in the
the name of the midwife, Pu'ah.
Yeah.
My next thought was, if this is indeed an Easter egg, I should find in these verses, in this chapter, more. All of I should find more Easter eggs to the other stories written by the same person that the scholars call the e-source, at least for the e-source for the first half of Exodus. I haven't yet dived into the last part. But the first half of Exodus, the isolate stories, we have a list of them. That's the baby genocide story, baby Moses story. God reveals his name to Moses. That's the burning bush. Then departure from Egypt. Then the song of the sea. And then there's also a song about Yitro, Jethro, talking with Moses about trials and judgments and ruling. He gives him some advice. So that's 6 stories. All of them are referenced in this one chapter, Isaiah 42. I can't see how that is a coincidence. Yahweh is my name. This is, for me, a reference to the burning bush when he's telling him his name. And also he's throwing shade at Jeremiah in this chapter. In their beef. Oh, I just found it the other day. He's lambasting the leadership in Jerusalem. This is verse 22. They are hiding in prisons when their people are being pillaged. Who was found in a prison when Jerusalem was pillaged? Jeremiah.
Yes.
Was hiding in a prison when Jerusalem was
so that
pillaged.
might make sense. Yeah, maybe throwing some shade on Jeremiah then. Yeah. It's kind of amazing to think that you may have discovered a connection. I mean, I know there's maybe no absolute proof, and maybe scholars will never buy your argument, but I just the chance of just looking at the whole thing from a different point of view just that's the fun of dealing with an incredible book like the Bible, right? That there's depth and there's connections that we can always keep on finding, you know?
Oh my goodness. So much. Every time I get to the next story, I'm thinking, okay, let's see. I hope this one is simple and direct, and that there are not too many layers. So this one will be easy. And I don't know. As of now, it's not easy.
Yeah,
just like everything, it just takes so long. Yeah.
I mean, it's such a complex book, and the way it was all put together was so complex that we're never going to get to the bottom of what happened, right? In terms of the creation of this incredible piece of literature. Absolutely.
But I'm going to try.
Yeah. Going to do your best. You're doing some pretty amazing things. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I wanted to, I don't think I had a chance to say, but I followed your argument in terms of, Baruch being behind, some of those key episodes in Genesis, especially around Joseph, and what a fascinating point of view on Genesis, and it kind of makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you.
When you talked about the baby in the basket and your personal connection to that, wow, that's that's something that brings a tear to people's eyes. Absolutely, yes.
Okay, so thank you very much, Scott.
Yes. Well, I really appreciate that, and maybe we can do this again.
Yes, definitely.
When you get a little bit further. Yes,
I'll be happy to.
That is it for this special episode of Retelling the Bible. The theme music for the podcast is Da by Kevin MacLeod, and the mood music for this episode is Things by Alexander Nakarada. The music is licensed under the Creative Commons and can be found at filmmusic.io. Sound effects were found on zapsplat.com. This is Retelling the Bible, and I've been your storyteller, W. Scott McCandless.